This is the Facts of Life, where research-based knowledge from the family and consumer sciences is brought to you with life applications. I'm your host, Amanda Harner.
And I'm Hope Smith, a family and consumer science educator and the graphic guru of the pod.
Our guest today is neuronutrition expert Dr. Emily Noble from the University of Georgia. And these are the facts on nutrition and neuroscience. I'm really excited to be talking with you today. And as you know, this is a topic that is of a lot of interest to me because I started to become very interested in the brain after my father suffered a traumatic brain injury. And we've had other family members go through things like strokes and Alzheimer's, but walking through this experience of severe traumatic brain injury sparked my interest in the brain in a way that I hadn't really been interested before. And after I had finished my master's in nutrition, I considered pursuing nutritional neuroscience. So I'm curious what led you into the field of nutritional neuroscience, because it's kind of, I feel like a newer study.
Okay, I can tell you the long story. This is going to be a long and windy tale, but after college, I worked on tall ships for a while. Do you know what tall ships are? They're like traditional sailboats. So, pirate ships, like wooden boats, many masts, lots of sails. And we did education. So we did environmental education. We would take out school groups, and I worked as a deckhand and an environmental educator. And we had a chef on board, and that chef got he's classically trained, but he didn't know, because he had never worked on boats before, that he got horribly seasick. And so we were sailing. I think we were maybe even in Canada at the time. And he just decided that was it. He was done. I don't know if you've ever been seasick before, but it's the worst in the world.
Yep. I people who know me well know I have horrible motion sickness, which is actually something we're investigating a little further right now.
They say that it's the fear that you're going to die, compounded by the fear that you're not going to die, because it's so bad when you're seasick. So I don't blame him, but he jumped ship in Canada, and he said, no, I'm not going to do this anymore. And we had no one to cook on board. And so I volunteered to cook. And it turns out I loved it. I just absolutely love cooking, and I was researching all the food, and I was like, how do I create a balanced diet? I loved it so much, and that I did it for maybe 4 years for cooking on sailboats after college. And at some point, I decided that I was done living on boats, and I didn't want to sleep in a bunk anymore, and I wanted to have like the comforts of land, but I loved my job. So I was like, well, if I didn't want to go to culinary school, because by that time I'd already done a bachelor's degree, and I was like, I don't want to go do this really expensive culinary school. And I thought, I'll go and get a master's in nutrition, and then I can be a private chef, but I'll have, this credential. So I went to grad school for a master's in nutrition. I did a thesis project. I looked at antioxidant chemistry in beans. So I was looking at polyphenols and flavonoids in beans. And while I was in grad school, I realized that I was kind of a nerd and that I love science. And I was taking this one course, this macronutrient metabolism course, and a woman came in to give a talk about nutrition in the brain. Her name was Catherine Kotz, and she studied orexins. The orexin system, really interesting, regulates wakefulness, spontaneous physical activity, so like how much you fidget, eating behavior to some extent. But she gave this talk, and she explained kind of how the brain regulates food intake, and how a lot of the reward circuitry that, a lot of drugs of abuse kind of act on are things that are there that naturally sort of like make things like eating really rewarding. So, for example, your brain makes its own cannabinoids. And when you haven't eaten in a while, that system is all upregulated, so that when you do eat, you have this sort of heightened sense of pleasure from food, or a heightened sensory experience. Your brain makes its own, opioids. endorphin stands for just like endogenous morphine, which is basically your brain's own natural reward system. So she starts explaining this whole thing, and I'm just like fascinated. And it, just like you said, it had never occurred to me that this was something that people study, that this was a field that you could go into. And I think it also mattered that here was a woman who was a neuroscientist, because it helped me sort of imagine like, oh, this is something that I could do, I could do too. It was like the whole representation of like female scientists, neuroscientists, studying the brain and eating behavior. And I went up to her immediately after that one class that she gave. And I was like, can I work in your lab? I want to do a PhD. I want to work with you. And she said, yeah, I think we can work that out. So that's how I got into the field. That's how I got interested in it, or that's how I got introduced to it. And it's interesting though, because then when I look back at like my undergrad experience, I was interested in neuroscience and I was interested in nutritional neuroscience. I just didn't know that that's what it was. Like when I look at I was like, oh, you have a choice. You can give a talk, or you can give a presentation about the topic of your choosing. I would choose things like, caffeine and learning and memory, or, vitamin A and vision, and all these things that really do have nutritional neuroscience roots.
Hopefully for younger listeners, maybe even older listeners too, because I'm a firm believer that like learning is a lifelong thing and can be to whatever extent you want it to be. Who knows who listens to this, who might need the encouragement. Like I was the kind of kid who I really struggled in high school. And I would say I thought I hated school, but it wasn't that I hated school. I'd been having a hard time. And I really learned later in life that I loved learning and am passionate about it. And so sometimes when you think it's the end of being able to do something, it's not really. And I think that's important for people to hear. So you primarily use rodents, so like rats and mice, to conduct your research, correct?
Yes. So we use rodent models so that we can get at some of the more mechanistic questions of like what's going on in the underlying physiology of how food affects the brain. There are certain things that you can learn from rodent models, but everything has to be taken that can very much apply across species, but everything has to be taken with a grain of salt and actually tested. So you would never say, I found that eating this particular diet makes, rats more impulsive. Therefore, we should recommend that nobody eat this diet. Like you would take it to humans, right? You would look at the human literature and you would see what happens next. So there's a lot that you can learn from rodent models, but we can especially learn about sort of the underlying mechanistic physiology. And so you have to look at not just one study, but all of the studies, right? Does this, for example, in rodent models, it's been shown that eating a diet that's high in saturated fat and added sugar negatively impacts a type of a brain region called the hippocampus. Hippocampus is really important for learning and memory function, but not all, just specific types of learning and memory function. So spatial navigation, contextual memory. So putting things into context, like where do I know that person from, or where have I seen that before? That's all hippocampal dependent learning and memory. Where did I park my car, right? And the hippocampus does a lot of other things as well, but this particular brain region has been shown to be really vulnerable to the effects of this sort of high saturated fat and sugar diet. So that's been shown in animal models, like over and over and over again, mouse models, rat models, and it's also been shown in humans. Not everything that's been studied in rats and mice and all these different, animals necessarily applies to humans. But in this particular case, it seems like there is something that kind of, there's pretty strong evidence of it across multiple species. And so now we can go back to the animal models and we can say, well, how is the diet affecting the brain? Like how is it affecting this particular brain region? What's going on? And so when you use a rat or a mouse model, you can actually look at the level of the tissue and you can say, is there neuroinflammation? Is there are there immune cells that are being activated in the brain? What's happening at the level of gene transcription? Are the cells doing okay? Are the mitochondria functioning properly? Are the cells able to metabolize energy? And we can ask those kinds of questions in rats and mice, but we can't obviously ask them in humans.
Yeah, it becomes a little bit of an ethical issue, right? Can you clarify the appropriate way for the audience to understand your research as it applies to them as human beings?
One of the biggest things that I like to say to my students, and this is something that I've learned from animal models and just from doing experiments. So we not only study how food affects the brain, but we also study how the brain regulates food intake and activity levels and things like that. The biggest thing that I learned is that we do not have as much control over our bodies and our behavior as we think we do, right? So, just sort of loosely, like if you take away nothing else, like I think that we spend a lot of time telling people like, diet and exercise, you need to eat this, you need to, control that, you need to, all the messages that you get, or the takeaway that people come away with is that I can control my body if there's something, if I'm struggling with my weight, if I'm struggling with my diet, it's probably my fault kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that is really apparent when you work with animal models is that there are physiological factors that are acting that are beyond your control. And with all the self-will in the world, you're not going to be able to necessarily overcome those factors, particularly in people who already have obesity, because obesity changes the brain, right? It changes the sensitivity to all the signals in the brain. It changes what happens when you overeat for one meal, what happens when you don't overeat for one meal. It changes your energy expenditure, like it changes all of these things. Mm-hmm. And so that is something that has been shown in animal models, has been shown in human models, sort of across the board. And the reason that I think that's so important to emphasize is because I think that the way that we try to give public health messages often ends up having this sort of unintended consequence of shaming people. I don't say that to be like, oh, we should all just give up, kind of thing. I think I say that because I want people to understand that like your physiology, your brain chemistry is something that it can be impacted by behavior, but it's not something that you have control over.
As someone who's more in the public health realm of nutrition, I really appreciate that because it is really challenging. We were talking right before we started recording that nutrition is sometimes a more complex science than people really think about it as. And I think part of that is we interact with nutrition every day, right? I mean, we have to eat to live. There's so many things about food and nutrition that impacts our daily lives. So it's kind of like this normal thing that's always there. But it's also very complicated, just whether you look at it through the lens of culture, whether you look at it through the lens of what's happening on a physical level, solely on a physical level. But even what happens on a physical level is impacted by what you're putting in, which may be impacted by how you're being raised. So I do really appreciate that because I think the takeaway is give yourself a break and at the same time control what you can control. So part of it is learning what can you control, because you certainly can control if you have two things available to you and one is an apple versus one is a 5-pound candy bar, what you choose is going to bear an effect. So, but at the same time, I do appreciate that, because some of the messages, I agree with you, some of the messages in public health are challenging, and oftentimes it doesn't help the dynamic in the situation when we're struggling and trying to make the right decisions and seeing, hey, I'm making all the right decisions and I'm gaining no ground. So,
which I guess I should clarify. Yes, of course, you can choose to eat the apple or you can choose to eat the candy bar. But a person who is at a point where their brain is not sensing a lot of the signals that it would normally sense, right? So a person who is not sensing these signals, what happens when they eat that apple? They may eat what seems like the standard adequate amount of calories of a meal, right? But experience of being like starving, I think we tend to think people are overeating because they just can't like stop eating cake or something like that. But what the data actually show is that the experience of people is, have you ever been like super, super, super like low blood sugar, really hungry, like have to eat now kind of thing? Angry, like
angry. Yes.
Imagine eating what would be like a normal like meal, but still having that feeling, right? There was a study that was done, and this was done actually in rodents, and then it was also done in humans. So it was done in rodents first, where they had animals eat a high fat, high sugar diet, which animals, they love it. They will gain weight on that diet until they were obese. And then they weight restricted them. They put them on a healthy diet and restricted them. And then they allowed them to eat as much as they wanted again of the healthy diet now. And what they found is that when they allowed them to eat as much as they wanted of the healthy diet, those that had previously been obese gained the weight back and then some, which matches with what you see in humans. Like most humans who will gain the weight back and then some. And they found that the reason for that was that most people, your body weight regulation falls along a predictable curve. So the bigger you are, the more energy expenditure you have. Imagine one person who is my size that needs 1,400 calories to maintain this size. A person who was maybe previously obese, lost the weight, and is now my size, right? For them, they found that anything that they would eat in excess of 800 calories would cause weight gain. So, and what's regulating your energy expenditure is your brain. Your brain is sending signals, right? That your brain signals directly to your fat. Your brain signals directly to, your brain plays a really critical role in sensing what's going on with your body weight and making adjustments to try to keep it stable. And what they found is that for whatever reason, people who previously were overweight and lost the weight, that system is dysregulated in that it's biasing them towards weight regain. And that's no matter what mechanism that people lose weight, except for bariatric surgery seems to have, the data anyway show that some people have had really long-term success. But most of the interventions that people have done with obesity, people will gain the weight back, and then some eventually. So, and the reason that bariatric surgery seems to work in some people is also at the level of like, it alters your hormone sensitivity. So I'm not advocating for anything. Like, I'm not saying like, oh, bariatric,
Yeah. Hormones are so interesting and there's so many of them.
Yeah. But my point is in saying that, it's not a fair deck of cards. So yes, you're right. We do have choices, but the experience of a person who is struggling with obesity is not the same as the experience of someone who's never had one. So when people start to say like, but just diet and exercise, it's, it really is not that easy in the sense that like you have one person who's experiencing like extremely low energy, extreme hunger, just feeling depleted because their brain is telling them they're depleted, right? Because they're sensing the signals that are saying you're not depleted. This animal study where they found, these changes in energy expenditure, Kevin Hall, who's a researcher, did a very similar study with previous contestants on The Biggest Loser. I don't know if you saw that study. It had a big New York Times article. Basically showed the same thing, which is people who were contestants on the show, their energy expenditure was much lower than what would have been predicted for their size, which suggests that their body is trying to gain the weight back, basically. They would have to eat very little to maintain their weight.
And this demonstrates how complicated it all is. We do still need to focus on having a nutritionally dense diet. It is good for us. And at the same time, there are a lot of things that are out of our control. And so I guess, to be fair too, it's not just about if you're struggling with your weight, giving yourself a break, but a break in the sense that you just try to understand that, like you said, the deck of cards might be stacked against you, unfortunately, but that other people should understand that too. And so we need to be cautious in how we make judgments and assumptions about what's going on. So your research is bidirectional on how the brain regulates feeding behavior and body weight, and how diet and exercise affect the brain and behavior. So what do we mean by bidirectional?
We're talking about whether we have control or we don't have control. Your comment about, choosing the apple really does matter over choosing the candy bar. And I agree with that statement. But the question is why, right? Why does choosing the apple better? Why is that a better choice than choosing the candy bar? And that's kind of the question that we're getting after, right? So we don't have control, right? But we do have a little bit, we don't have ultimate control, but we do have a little bit of choices, right?
We can't beat it into submission.
Making certain choices can actually change your brain, right? And then change what your brain does in the future. So a lot of the data show that with obesity anyway, while the cards are stacked against you, one of the things that normalizes that is exercise. And it's not for the reasons that you might think necessarily. It's not about necessarily the calories that you burn during exercise. It's the fact that exercise does something to change your brain, to make it easier for you to maintain a healthier body weight in the future. And so the question is why? What is exercise doing for the brain? So just as much as I said, this region of the brain, the hippocampus, is impacted by diets that are high in saturated fat and added sugar, it's also been really extensively shown that exercise improves the function of this brain region. So brain plasticity. So it improves how well the cells connect with each other, improves how they metabolize energy. It just improves learning and memory in general. Mm-hmm. It's been described as miracle grow for the brain, right? Exercise.
That's fun.
You don't really understand why. So that's the question. So if our choices do matter in that they affect our future behaviors, how are those choices influencing our future behaviors? And that's what I mean by bidirectional. So how does and I should say, so in addition to studying how behaviors impact the brain and future behavior, we also study the circuits in the brain that regulate eating behavior. So that's more basic science kind of. When I say basic science, the basic physiological mechanisms is what I mean, right? So understanding how the brain works, looking at all the different signaling pathways and manipulating those signaling pathways and saying, when we activate cells that go from this region to this region, does the animal eat more or less? When we activate cells that go from this region to this region, does it make the animal want to move? Does it make the animal want to exercise? If we inhibit this particular cell type, what are the consequences for behavior? So we look at both how the brain regulates these types of behaviors and then how these types of behaviors act on these brain regions.
So I want to kind of come back to the exercise thing in terms of in a practical way, because I think sometimes the risk for people who are really, really struggling with their weight can be really overdoing it with exercise. So what does the research show in terms of, are we talking moderate exercise? What does the research show in that regard?
I guess you'd have to look at the human study. Certainly with like older humans, it wouldn't be like high intensity. I mean, a lot of the study shows that even moderate exercise has a benefit in terms of brain function.
So like walking.
Yeah, I'm less familiar with the human literature, I'll say that. But when you on body weight regulation and how the brain helps with body weight regulation in youth, in adolescents, in males who are overweight, high intensity interval exercise actually helps reduce their appetite. But what's interesting is that in females, and this is actually true in rodent models as well, if you give male rats access to a running wheel, and they're overweight, they will eat less. Like they'll lose weight and their weight loss will be caused not by the calories that they burn from exercise, but by reducing how much they eat. But the females will both run more and eat more. So the females will compensate for the calories that they burn during exercise by eating more. And that in some ways, I think is because, just in general, females have a greater preservation of body fat, which they need for, we need for like
reproduction and
purposes and just health in general.
Can you highlight some of your key findings and takeaways from the research that you think may be the most relevant to humans?
Looking at diets that are high in saturated fat and sugar and how they affect function of the hippocampus, we did have one study where we showed that exercise actually overcame the negative effects of the high fat, high sugar diet on learning and memory function. And I think there's evidence for that being the case in humans as well. It's really hard to study in humans because it's hard to get accurate measures of food intake and that kind of thing. But certainly it's supported by epidemiological evidence. So there's maybe like 4 or 5 different groups right now that have published animal models of food insecurity, and they're all kind of showing similar findings. So the way that we're modeling food insecurity, we're feeding animals at scheduled times, right? Mm-hmm. But we have a group that gets scheduled meals. We have a group that gets scheduled meals of a healthy diet, one that gets scheduled meals of an unhealthy diet, and then one that gets scheduled meals of an unhealthy diet. But randomly they'll miss a meal, but they'll get the food later on. So they're not calorically deficient, like they're getting the same amount of food as the other animals. They're just getting it at unpredictable times. So there are times where they skip breakfast. There are times where they skip dinner, and they don't know when that's going to be. So there's this sort of energy unpredictability. What we found and what matches with what others have shown is that later on in life, when you put those animals, when you give them access to like a choice, high fat, high sugar kind of diet, they can eat or chow, they can eat what they want. They put on more body fat. So there weren't really noticeable differences in how much they ate, or even in their body weight, but they were storing more of their energy in fat. And that's been shown in birds, starlings. There's a food insecurity, and I should clarify, this is food insecurity during the adolescent phase of development. So this is juvenile food insecurity, and juvenile birds, juvenile rats. There was a study that was just published in mice. In the females, anyway, they store more energy as fat, and so we're looking into that now to try to see like what's going on, why that might be the case, what might be happening. But
Very interesting.
and so I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say exactly how that applies to humans, other than, yes, moderate food insecurity is associated with obesity later in life. But there's a lot of other factors that go along with food insecurity, and it's hard to just sort of isolate the component of food uncertainty in humans. And so that's
right.
model it is like, well, what about this food unpredictability? And then I guess what you can kind of do with that information is like, well, maybe it's really critical that we make sure that everybody have consistent access to food, you know?
One of the other areas that you study is the gut microbiome, which is a super fascinating area. So what is the gut microbiome and what does it have to do with the brain?
So the gut microbiome is made up of trillions of microorganisms that inhabit our gastrointestinal tract. Our gut microbiome is first colonized when we're born. It is highly variable for the first 3 years of life. And then kind of like settles after that. But certain things like dietary changes or exercise can alter the populations of microorganisms that are in our gut. So when we study the gut microbiome, we study bacteria, but there's other microorganisms as well. But we're just right now, the field is really focused on the gut bacteria. You can really get like into the weeds because, like, you know, our bodies are just like covered in these bacteria, and that there's all these different ecosystems. So like the ecosystem in the gut is so different from the ecosystem that's like on your skin, and the ecosystem isn't, you know, like you can think of it as like the population in the desert versus the population in the rainforest. That's how different they are. So what decides sort of what populations are there, who gets to stay, who doesn't? Some of the bacteria have positive health benefits for us. Other bacteria maybe have some negative health consequences for us. And so that's one of the reasons why people are super interested in it. Your gastrointestinal tract, which, you know, has its own nervous system, the enteric nervous system, is directly communicating with your brain. It does so through a couple of different ways. So one way is there's a nerve that goes from your gut to your brain and signals in your brain called the vagus nerve. And another way is your gastrointestinal tract, as I mentioned before, maybe has cells lining your GI tract that produce hormones. And those hormones can communicate with all the different various organ systems, including with your brain. So there's been evidence to show that by manipulating the populations of bacteria that are in the gastrointestinal tract, it can have direct consequences for brain function, and especially for brain development. So during early life, so some of the earlier studies that were done in mice, actually, they raised mice in a germ-free environment. There was no way for them to be colonized by bacteria, and they were living in these isolators, so sterile environments, basically. Mm-hmm. What they found is that these mice did not develop normally, right? They showed a lot of abnormal behaviors, like they showed really high levels of anxiety-like behavior. If they inoculated these mice with bacteria during early life, it would reduce a lot of those weird behavioral symptoms. But if they introduced gut bacteria later in life, the animals still behaved with this sort of high anxiety-like behavior, impaired learning and memory function, a lot of different negative consequences. So that was early evidence that suggested maybe these gut bacteria are actually really important for helping our brains to develop normally. And now there's a ton of research about the gut microbiome and how it might influence the brain. But it's still, even though there's so much research coming out all the time, the field is so much in its infancy, and we don't quite understand how to ask the questions even. We don't fully understand how these bacteria operate. They do a lot of funny things, like They can swap genes. You can take, the same bacteria, same species, and put it and depending on what environment you put it in, it can behave totally differently. So we don't fully understand exactly how they operate, but it's always important in any field to have those early studies where you can build on those, and later on people will probably go back and be like, wow, all that stuff we thought we knew, we really didn't understand how that worked.
Right. It'll be interesting to see how it evolves.
The immune system plays a big role too in determining what bacteria get to stay and what don't, right?
So how does added sugar play into this?
So I've done some research. I'm really interested, probably mentioned it a couple of times, but in this sort of, because especially the bacteria are so variable during early life, and that time period seems to be really important for brain development. A lot of your brain regions are still developing. We kind of all know that, like anyone who has a teenager at home kind of knows that like your brain is still developing during that time period. It's really a critical period of development. When I say critical period, in meaning that environmental factors can influence how that brain region developed. I mentioned that diets that are high in saturated fat and sugar negatively affect this brain region called the hippocampus. So the next kind of question that we went to ask was, well, what happens if you just give a lot of added sugar? Like, how important is it the sugar, or is it the fat that really matters? So we did a study where we looked at added sugar and how it impacts the development of this brain region, the hippocampus. And and this was actually built on some research that a colleague of mine did, where he compared two different types of sugar during this adolescent phase of development. So he compared high fructose corn syrup solution and sucrose solution. And then he looked at how that impacted the function of this brain region, the hippocampus. And what he showed is that hippocampal dependent learning and memory was negatively impacted by the high fructose corn syrup solution, but not the sucrose solution. So
can you, for the audience's sake, explain the difference between those two sugars? Where are they found?
There were all these commercials that came out from maybe the Corn Growers Association that were saying like, compositionally, these are the same thing.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily untrue, right? So they're very similar. High fructose corn syrup is almost half glucose and almost half fructose. And sucrose is 50-50, glucose and fructose. But chemically, there are two different structures. So sucrose is like table sugar. High fructose corn syrup is a type of sweetener that's made from corn that is in many of the beverages that we love. But it was just a way that was found that we could manufacture sugar out of corn, right? And high fructose corn syrup is kind of sweeter than sucrose, actually. It's in liquid form, and it's about like be 55% fructose, 42% glucose, and then some other stuff. And then table sugar is 50-50 glucose and fructose. High fructose corn syrup is the two sugars are separated from each other, so it's they're in monosaccharide kind of form. So the sugars independently, whereas sucrose, table sugar, the sugars are bound together and they have to be broken apart before they become individual sugars. So they're disaccharides versus monosaccharides. So chemically, they're two different things, but if you just look at the percentage of fructose and glucose, they're very similar. At least according to this study that my colleague did, they impacted the brain differently. So we went from there and we focused only on the high fructose corn syrup solution, because that is what is more commonly found in many of the commonly consumed sugar sweetened beverages in the US anyway. And so we focused on the high fructose corn syrup solution, and we asked the question, what happens to the gut microbiome when you feed animals this high fructose solution during early life? And we fed them a solution that was 11% high fructose corn syrup, which matches what is often found in beverages. That's kind of the magic ratio that we like. It did have an impact on the gut microbiome, and it impacted learning and memory function negatively, just like my colleague had shown as well. And so we looked a little further and we said, all right, we got all these, it's a whole ecosystem, right? So the way you analyze it is you look at the genes and identifying all the different species that are there. So you identify all these different species, but you have all this data, like it's like tons of species, and then you have to find the meaning out of it. Like, if I were to just analyze everything that's in the jungle, and give you all that information, you would be like, where do you even start to try to figure out like what the culprit is, right? I've given you all these different species. So what we did was we asked the question, are any of these species correlated with learning and memory function? And are there, of the ones that are correlated with learning and memory function, are any of them elevated by the sugar? And we found this one particular genus, Parabacteroides. It's this one type of bacteria that was increased by sugar consumption and negatively correlated. And it was related to how well they performed in the task. So the more of the stuff that was around, the worse they did on the task. We looked a little deeper and we said, well, which species belong to this genus and which are involved in the correlation? We identified a couple of different species. We grew those species with the collaborator at UCLA. She actually happened to have some because she was studying them for a different reason. She grew those species. We enriched the gut bacteria of a new group of rats that had never had sugar with these species. And we asked the question, do these species impact brain development and learning and memory function? And it turned out that they did. But they impacted more than just the type of learning and memory function that we were studying, which was the hippocampal dependent. They actually impacted a lot of different types of learning and memory function. And they influenced the metabolism of the host. So it was really interesting though, because, and you're talking about like, what can we learn and what can't we learn? And how do we interpret the information? Like we published this paper, showing that this particular species of bacteria was, impacting this behavior. Somebody else published another paper at a very similar time showing where they only measured like different sort of metabolic outcomes. And they were like, Parabacteroides improves, blood sugar and like all these other outcomes. So, in science, you only get what you're looking for specifically and nothing else. So, we had two very different interpretations. Here we're saying like, oh, be careful, watch out for this bacteria. And somebody else is saying, hey, this bacteria might really actually help you with your blood sugar regulation, might help you lose weight. And both are probably true. Like it does, our data matched with what this person showed, what this group showed. It's just that they didn't measure learning and memory function. And we weren't looking from the perspective of, oh, this might actually be really helpful for something. So anyway, don't go rushing out and take probiotics or like enriching your gut with different bacteria just yet, because we don't have the full picture of what's going on.
So that is actually a good closing point. You're studying most of your research, well, all your research, I guess, takes place in rodent models. So, which is different than a human being, even though we can glean a lot from those studies. What is the appropriate way for people to digest this information? What is existing within the realm of public health tools currently that your research would say, it's just reinforcing what there's already a strong body of evidence for?
There's really strong evidence that exercise is really good for your brain. There's really strong evidence that like probably not a good idea, especially in developing young people, to have most of your calories coming from sugar. Eating a healthy diet when you're young can help support your brain development. I mean, there's really strong evidence in humans and in animals, regardless of weight loss or regardless of whether it helps you regulate your body weight. There's really strong evidence that exercise is healthy for your brain, sort of across.
Yeah, I appreciate the comment about fiber, partly because we know what's rich in fiber, fruits and vegetables. So, they are a great way to get fiber.
And a lot of the, and this is not related to anything that I've just said, but in general with fruits and vegetables, like, I guess it is kind of related in that, like, we don't have the full picture yet kind of way, but I think that people think that, oh, science says I need this vitamin, this mineral, these antioxidants, this whatever. And so we're like, oh, if I just take this supplement, that'll help me with that thing. But like with fruits and vegetables, all of these, it's not just one vitamin, one mineral, one polyphenol, one flavonoid. They're in a matrix of fiber, and how they behave in that matrix, just like your gut microbiome. Like, one bacteria is not the same as the entire complex ecosystem of that matrix. And the same thing is true of food. So we don't know yet whether, extracting that one polyphenolic compound is and consuming that is going to have the same effect as ingesting that fiber matrix with the polyphenols and everything mixed in. But I think intuitively we know, we know when we feel good, when we eat certain foods or when we do certain behaviors, and we know how it impacts our lives. So
I think that's a good place to wrap up. Do you have anything else that you feel like would be helpful to share?
No, I don't think so. Thanks for having me on.
Research-based resources referenced in and related to this episode of Facts of Life podcast can be found in the episode notes and description.
The views and thoughts expressed in this video podcast are the speaker's own and do not necessarily represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of the University of Georgia or the guest organizations and/or employers. The material and information presented here is for general information purposes only. The University of Georgia name, as well as those of guest organizations, and all forms and abbreviations are the property of its owner, and its use does not imply endorsement of or opposition to any specific organization, product, or service.
These are the facts of life. Thanks for joining us. Check out our website at factsoflife.extension.uga.edu. That's FACS of life.extension.uga.edu.